By there was a hostage taking at Union Station in Toronto, in which middle of rush hour, gunmen took a hostage very publicly. Tons of people around, media was watching, and we woke up one morning and the clock radio was playing that this was unfolding. We went downstairs and watched it on television, and within about 20 minutes, the man had been shot and sniped by a police sniper. And it's very shocking, and it's very much the terrain of movies and films, and it's a, it is a shock when you see it happen in real life, because it just doesn't happen, and it was reported around the world, and that really got us thinking, boy, this really doesn't happen. So what is it going to be like for the police officer that took that shot? And there's lots of films about criminals and negotiators and detectives and victims, but there has never really been a show about the SWAT guys that have the plan, that go in there in the fourth act and it's like, okay, Alpha Team go, and they go in and then they go, okay, good job, Joe, and that's sort of it. And here it was 9:30 in the morning, and we got to thinking, what's the rest of the day like for this man who's just had to take another man's life? And so we didn't pitch that idea. We actually had a meeting with our agents that morning about a short film, because we come from the film world, not the television world. And she said, I know you're film people, Leslie Harrison. She said, I know you're film people, but how would you feel about making some quick and dirty money from CTV, because it sounds like a great movie of the week? And we said, oh, sure, we like writing things, it's all quite new to us, and so absolutely. And so we pitched the idea to Leslie Grant one morning over coffee, and she was intrigued, and she asked us to write a one-pager. And we did a one-pager, and this was a subsequent talking to some police officers and learning more about the Toronto Emergency Task Force, which is different from other SWAT teams in that they're trained in profiling and human behavior assessment and psychology. So we took that idea, we made it into a one-pager, and at the end of this one-pager, Stephanie and I, who, as I'm intimating, come from, we're from a background as actors and as short filmmakers and aspiring filmmakers, and we were looking at the shows that we were watching right then, which was CSI and 24, and like, why are we watching these shows? What's drawing us in? Well, we said at the end of this pitch document it should have the visual appeal of CSI Miami and pace of 24, which was very naive, because that's very expensive to do and it's not often done. And so we put that out there, and Bill Mustos, who's now the executive producer on the show, was at that time still at CTV. He greenlit Movie of the Week, as Rob has said. We developed that over the course of about a year and a half. During that time, Bill left CTV to go on sabbatical for a year in France. In that time, he decided that once he was back, he was going to get into producing, into creative production. In the meantime, the show, as Rob said, had progressed from being a movie of the week and had risen up the pile to becoming a potential series, and we took the 2-hour script for the movie of the week and we condensed it into a 1-hour pilot in about 7 days.
Well, maybe I should just rewind a little bit. That part of that transition involved CTV pairing us up with Anne-Marie Latraverse, who is one of their familiar producers. And we met with her. She was very intrigued by the premise and by the script. And she became its first champion.
She was the one to look at that. It should have the look of CSI and the pace of 24, and she really got that.
Yeah.
And when we ultimately made the pilot, she put all of the money in front of the screen, and we shot in 35mm film. We worked really extensively in testing the look with David Frazee, who's the director and has since directed many of the episodes and is responsible for that pacing. And working in post-production to give a rich color palette, nice saturation, making sure the city was shown off, that it wasn't hidden. And I think that it was that vision that she brought to it that led to a pilot that was ultimately appealing to CBS and to CTV.
We are curious about what is the life like behind the uniform, behind the ballistic shield. We were learning more and more about stories that have not yet been told, about what it's like to have that kind of life and death responsibility, those life and death skills, and at the same time have to be trained in the kind of human sensitivity that makes it break your heart when you have to take someone's life. How does that affect you when you go home as a police officer? All this to say, we were not being driven at this point at all by market concerns, we were driven by a story that was keeping us awake at night, and by people who we had met who made strong, strong impressions on us.
We met one cop, Jimmy Bremner, who was with the Toronto Emergency Task Force, and we met him at a very interesting time in his life because he'd been involved with a couple of shootings. The first one had been at St. Michael's Hospital in 2000 on New Year's Eve when a man walked into the emergency room with an infant and a baby carrier, and he demanded treatment, and they said, okay, baby seems okay, wait your turn. He said, no, I want to see a doctor right now. And they said, no, wait your turn, and he pulled out a gun, and he took a doctor hostage. And Jimmy was involved with a negotiation as he was the team leader of a team, sort of the Ed Lane equivalent on our show. And he was about 2 meters away from this subject, and there was another officer with a rifle another 2 meters away, and then there was a negotiator. And they were talking to this man, and the way it works in negotiating is that if you can talk to a subject when they've set a deadline, this guy was saying, if I don't get what I want by 12 o'clock, then this is going to be over. If you can get him talking past that deadline, then you're probably going to be fine, and you're going to save him. So they got him talking past that 12 o'clock deadline. And they thought, this is great, we're going to be able to get to him. They thought they were making progress. And then he raised his gun and he pointed it at the negotiator and said, this ends now, and they had to shoot him. And so Jimmy did this, and he shot him from about 2 meters away. And he showed us pictures of the scene, and it was the first time that he'd had to shoot somebody. And he was back on the job the next morning. And 2 days later, there was another call for a domestic dispute where they were called in, and there was a husband and wife arguing. He was thrown into the fray. This guy wound up pulling a knife. They were on him. It was a close quarter combat struggle. All of a sudden, they smelled gunpowder. Jimmy smelled gunpowder. He realized he was covered in blood, and he didn't know that it was his blood.
He didn't hear the gunshot either.
They didn't hear the gunshot. And then he realized that he'd fired the weapon and that he'd shot this man. And it was very, as he puts it, if an officer doesn't get treatment within 48 hours, or if an officer takes a drink within 48 hours, then they're in trouble. And Jimmy was in trouble, and he wound up becoming an alcoholic. He wound up getting picked up for sleeping in his car one morning, trying to sleep it off, and he got arrested, and the book was thrown at him, and he lost his job with the Emergency Task Force, and he checked into rehab, and almost lost his wife, and all these terrible things. And he told us all this stuff, and it was really great. And he told us all these other stories about officers, and we started to realize that this show is really about, as much about the subjects and the guest stars and the stories that we tell every week as it is about the officers. And so we carried that, and I say all this because we carried that seed of passion with us that was born with him, that we carried forward, that became the storytelling that we wanted to do. And then the challenge became, ultimately, how do you create a mainstream network procedural show that is going to maintain that level of inner interest and passion along the way?
So do you want, I just wanted to sort of reframe it a little bit so that we're back on our chronology. At this point, we have a completed pilot, which was done stunningly. The visuals on it were just beautiful. We had set the tone for the show. We had set the premise for the show. We created, working very closely with CTV, we sort of created a moving forward document, a Bible of sorts. And we wrote the script for the second episode, which was going to become the formula, basically, of introducing the subject and how the team converges with that subject, and then where do they go together. And this was very close to the time of the beginning of the writer's strike in the States.